text for today.
Matthew 16, verses 15 to 19. He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to see you today. I'm going to take this brother's iPad and put it right here. Don't forget where that went. Hey, it's a privilege and a joy to get to be with you today. Thank you so much, Pastor Scott, for this invitation. And I know this is a missions-minded church, and that's different than being a mission church. Everybody has a mission. You know, in our local churches, in the Church of the Nazarene, we say our mission is to make Christ-like disciples in our cities and our nations. But it's also, there's such a thing as a missions church, and that's with the S on the end. And missions represents the kind of a church that we're going to be a part of that goes into all the world to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I just want to say, Pastor, thank you to Wichita First Church. You're not only a church that has been a legacy church in this city for more than 100 years, you have been known, you actually have a reputation of being a church that has committed themselves to sending the gospel around the world. And I know it happens because of people like, Peggy Hefner as your missions president. It's hard not to do things with excellence when she's your missions president. But the truth is, you've been doing that for generations. And on behalf of the Global Church of the Nazarene in 165 world areas, almost 3 million strong, I want to say thank you for leading the way. And I mean that. I can't say that in every church I'm a part of, but let's say thanks to the Lord and thanks to the legacy of your church. Let's praise the Lord together. I'm just getting to know Pastor Scott. I've known pastors of Wichita First over the years. You've had some really, really good ones. But the more I'm getting to know Pastor Scott, the more I know how much you love him. Would you like to say thank you to your leader here at your church? Thanks, Pastor. I'm going to assume that there's a lot of people here that don't know a lot about the Church of the Nazarene just because you didn't grow up in the church as I did. And so let me start by just giving like a really brief overview, a history of what kind of a church that we've been and why we're here for a Sunday like this. So the Church of the Nazarene is 115 years old, and I've been asking myself, were any of you here 115 years ago? So if you weren't here, what was in the heart of the founders of the church? What was it about our church that made them say, let's create this holiness denomination back in 1908? And it got me to thinking about how we got our name. You know, you have an N in your name. When I came up here, it said Wichita First Church of the... How did that start? You know, as a kid growing up, I grew up in a Nazarene town. It was called Bethany, Oklahoma. You think I'm kidding. It was actually a Nazarene town started by Nazarenes. I didn't even know a girl that didn't go to church. So that's how Nazarene we were. And there was times where I thought to myself, Nazarene, Church of the Nazarene, that's kind of cumbersome. It doesn't even sound cool. It's not like, Methodist or Presbyterian, and those things just kind of flow off the tongue. And I thought, but Church of the Nazarene, I even lived on a street, I'm not kidding you, called Peniel. That's how Nazarene my town was. until I found out how we got our name. Did you know that back in 1908, there was a group of Nazarene leaders who got together? They had an all-night of prayer. And on that all-night of prayer, what they wanted to decide was, what shall we call ourselves? And that next morning, one of the lay people in the group, a lay person is somebody who's not a pastor, so they didn't have reverend in front of their name. His name was J.P. Whitney. He was actually the president of a little school called University of Southern California. And he said, I think we should call ourselves the Church of the Nazarene. And here's why. Because Jesus was born in a place called? No. I got you. It works every time. He was born in a place called Bethlehem. You knew that. I tricked you. He was born in Bethlehem. And so why in the world did he move to Nazareth? Because, most people in the first century, the town they were born in, that's where they stayed their whole life. So how did someone born in a place like Bethlehem end up in a place called Nazareth? It's because when Jesus was 2 years old, an angel of the Lord came to his father, Joseph, and said, there's a king whose name is Herod. And he's jealous of the fact that he heard that Bethlehem is the place of the Messiah and that there's a king of the Jews being raised up here. And so he's going to send and have every male baby 2 years old and younger killed in Bethlehem. And that's exactly what Herod ended up doing. You can read about it in the Bible. But Joseph said, where can I take Jesus that will protect him? Where's the one place in the world where nobody would expect a king to come from? I know where I'll take him. I'll take him to Nazareth. Nazareth was a little tiny, insignificant village in the middle of nowhere. It was a place where people went to hide. It was a place of marginalized people, people who had bad reputations. They ended up in Nazareth, and they were hardworking, blue-collar people. Nobody with power lived in Nazareth. And yet that's where Jesus spent the majority of his days. In fact, there was a saying in that day, can anything good come from Nazareth? How'd you like to have people say that about Wichita? Can anything good come from Wichita? And that's where Jesus spent 30 years of his growing up years, but that's where he spent the majority of his ministry. He didn't spend it in the South, down in Jerusalem. That's where the power brokers were. That's where, the influential people were. He spent it working with people on the margins, people living in poverty, serving people who didn't have other people to serve them. And that's what those early Nazarenes decided. They said, let's be known as the Church for Nazareth people. Everybody wants the rich people at their church, and there's nothing wrong with having wealthy people in your congregation. But what if we were a church that was known for ministering to people that nobody else wanted from a place where nobody wanted to be from? And that's how the Church of the Nazarene got our name. And I thought, for the first time as a kid, I like the Church of the Nazarene. Now take a look at this picture. This is a picture of our founder. His name was Phineas Brazee. What a cool name. I almost makes me wish I had another son so I could name him Phineas. But here he is. He came as a very a comfortable position. He was serving in the Methodist Church as what they call a district superintendent. And he went to work on Skid Row in Los Angeles, California in the early 1900s. He had the first Church of the Nazarene. He went from, living in this place to working with people who were addicted. He was a powerful preacher of ministering to Nazareth-type people. Now, I was born and raised in Bethany. I told you I was raised in Bethany, Oklahoma. And I wanted to know, how did the Church of the Nazarene get started in Oklahoma? So let me just give you a quick update. Back in the early 1900s, Bethany First Church started along with that little college at the time known as Bethany Nazarene College. They started with 33 members. The total monies raised in that church in the early 1900s was $54.30. And not only that, the pastor's salary was $13 annually. Now, you say some things haven't changed, but these were not wealthy people, Dr. Nash. These were not affluent people, but these were generous people. And you know that Oklahoma was one of the last states to come together, and up until that point, they were called a territory, and they were full of bandits and outlaws and cowboys and dislocated people. In other words, Oklahoma was filled with Nazareth-type people. And again, you say not much has changed on that either. But take a look at this picture. For example, here's one of the early Nazarenes that lived in Oklahoma. Her name was Maddie Mallory. Did you know a Nazarene person opened the very first orphanage in the Oklahoma Territory in 1897? You know how she did that? She did it by taking all of her inheritance money and investing it to try to help kids who didn't have parents. And there was lots of them in Oklahoma. This next picture is a picture of C.B. Jernigan, and that's his wife, Johnny. C.B. was the first district superintendent. That's what Dr. Nash was for the Kansas district for a lot of years here. But his wife, Johnny, she opened the Beulah Heights Rescue Home for unwed mothers. Can you imagine? Their mission statement was for penitent, homeless, and friendless girls. Because there were so many unwed mothers. An unwed mother is somebody who doesn't have a husband, but they have a child or children. By 1912, buckle your seatbelts. By 1912, 147 babies were born in that Nazarene home for unwed mothers. Now, folks, that was 100 years ago. Can you even imagine the scandal of that? One of my favorite early Nazarene photos is Johnny Jernigan, this next one. This is her with a Nazarene deaconess, and they've got 5 babies in a wheelbarrow. They're just pulling, babies. There's so many babies. When Johnny's health began to fail in 1916, they had to close that home, and most of those girls ended up being turned over to the deaconess home in Oklahoma City. By the way, that turned into the hospital where I was born, so I have a lot of roots there. But by the time they shut the door of that home for unwed mothers of Nazarenes, 700 girls had lived in that home. I'm talking about the roots we have of working with Nazareth people. Now that leads me to that passage that we heard read just a moment ago. It's that passage of Jesus saying, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Did you know that's the first time in the Bible that the word church is used? The word church is a Greek word. It's 2 Greek words actually put together. Look what it is. Ecclesia or ecclesia. Say ecclesia. You just said church. And the word ek means out of. The word kaleo means called or sent. And so when we're talking about the church, we're talking about the people of God who have been set aside by the Spirit of God, filled with His Spirit, but not left there to hold hands and wait for Jesus to come back. But now filled with the Spirit, those people are sent back into the world as ambassadors of the gospel. That's what the church means. See, we get confused sometimes. We think the church is this building, and we even invite people to church. But did you know the building isn't the church? You are the church. The church has spirit inside. Turn to your neighbor and say, we are the church. See, this isn't what we're talking about when he says, I will build my church. And I love this facility, by the way. Kudos to you. This church, this facility looks marvelous. But this isn't the church. This is the building. You are the church. And Jesus said, I will build my church. And then he said, the gates of hell. And the word hell here is another Greek word. You've probably heard of this one. It's the word Hades. Say Hades. Hades was the ancient people's way of talking about 2 things: the place of death and the powers of death. And it was the greatest fear of ancient people. So the place of death, meaning that hell is a real place. Hell is not just a figment of our imagination. Hell is a real place. It's the place of death. But that there's also the spirit of death that lives in the world. And so the gates of hell, when Jesus said this word, he used it as a symbolic way to talk about everything that is working against the purposes of God in the world. And so if God is a God of life, which God is, then hell opposes God's life with death. And if God is a God of love, which God is, then hell opposes that in the world by creating fear. How many of you know there's a lot of fear in the world today? And if God is a God of freedom, then hell opposes that freedom with oppression. See, hell is a real place, according to Jesus, but it's also about the powers of death and destruction that would try to ravage and destroy what God has made beautiful and good in the world. Are you with me? I will build my church, you, and the gates of hell, the powers of hell, will not prevail against my church. Now, for years, I'm going to make a confession to you. I had an image in my mind of what this passage was about. And my image was, here we had all the powers of hell at work in the world. And if you don't know what those are, just go to Facebook. You'll find out what those are. All the powers of hell attacking the church, intimidating the church, battering the church, bullying the church. And here we are, we're this little tiny, weak, anemic church. And here comes the devil, and hell. And he comes over and he's picking on us and bullying us. And we're like, no. But now we have Jesus as our Savior, and Jesus comes along and stands in the way and said, I'm not going to let you bully my church, and he becomes, the big brother that takes care of the bad devil. That was the image I had in my mind. A weak, anemic church with a strong Jesus. But then one day I got to thinking about exactly what Jesus said here. He used the phrase gates. And it dawned on me that gates are not weapons. Gates are for protection. You don't pick up a gate and, fight somebody with your gate. When's the last time you saw a war movie and the general is looking out over the battlefield and said, okay, this has gone on long enough. They pushed me too far. We're bringing out the big guns now. Somebody go get the gates. Nobody says that. You know why? Because gates are not for attacking. Gates are for protecting. Gates are a defensive measure, not an offensive measure. Now, in my younger days, I played football. By the way, it's so nice to be able to say football without trying to explain soccer and all that. And I played on the offense. I don't have to tell people in Kansas about football. Yeah, go Chiefs. Okay, we got that out of the way. But the offense is the part of the team that's trying to drive down the field and score a touchdown. The offense is trying to penetrate the defense, whose job it is, the opposing defense, to try to stop the offense. And so the offense has a mindset of attacking and pushing and advancing. And the defensive mindset is entrenching and holding them back, and pushing them back, way back. And so offense, pushing, attacking, advancing; defense, protecting, entrenching, holding ground. Stay with me for a second. This next picture is a picture of an ancient city wall. And I say that because if you were an ancient world city, you could only have a city if you had a wall. Otherwise, your enemies would come and just, maul your city and take it over. And there was just two ways to attack a city in the ancient world. You either had to go over the wall, which was a really bad idea, because the walls were high and they were thick and they were strong, and you had to scale over the top, and there was people at the top of the walls, and they were, dropping things on you and shooting you with bows and arrows and pouring hot oil on you. You didn't want to be the first guy over the wall. If your general said, you go first, he didn't love you. So what you did is you said, where can we attack the most vulnerable part of these walls? And guess where that was? The gate. The gate is the most weak, vulnerable part of the city wall. And so that's where people focus. If they wanted to attack the city, they attacked the gate. Now remember, gates are defensive, gates are closed, gates are locked, gates protect, gates keep people out. Who is Jesus saying has the gates? Think about it a minute. Who is playing defense according to Jesus? The gates of what? Hell will not prevail against the church. Hell has the gates. So who is on offense according to Jesus? You don't trust me anymore because I did that Bethlehem trick on you. Heaven is on offense. God's people, the church, is on offense. And Jesus is giving us an image here of a church attacking hell, driving back its gates, and hell not surviving the assault. And I missed this point for so long that the ecclesia, the called out, filled up ones, we're the ones on offense. We're not playing defense as a church. And that the powers of death and the powers of hell and the powers of the grave will eventually crumble under the forward advance of the Church of Jesus Christ. Is that good news? And that's like a new image for some of us. Because we're so used, so much of our teaching, when we talk about spiritual warfare and things like that, it's about the enemy attacking us. That's what we call spiritual warfare, how to defend ourselves against the enemy attacking us. And so sometimes we measure victory in the Christian life as our ability to resist the attack of the evil one. And so as Christians, if we don't steal and we don't lie, and we don't commit adultery, and we generally avoid doing bad stuff, we call that success and we call that holy living. And there's obviously some truth to that. I'm not trying to take away the truth of that. But have you noticed that there's a lot of religious people who can resist all that stuff and not do a lot of bad things, and they can still be so dry and so barren and so lack of joy, and some of them can just be mean as a junkyard dog? Why is that? It's because a part of advancing the mission of Jesus Christ and the mission of God is that we're not simply given the ability to avoid evil, we're given the power to do what's right. We're given the power to advance the kingdom. And so as we advance the light, we push back the darkness. And the church is on offense. Turn to your neighbor and say, we are on offense. Go ahead and tell them that. Now, here's the big question. How? I think once you understand the church isn't playing defense, the question we have to ask is, how are we on offense? And I just discovered this a few years ago. Jesus actually tells us how the church is on offense right here in this passage. Look at what he says. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Now let's hold that on the screen for a second. I want you to study that. I don't know everything that Jesus meant by what he said when he said this, but I know two things. Number one, I know he's talking to us about the keys of the kingdom. And so whatever this is about, this isn't something kind of trivial or incidental. This is something vital and essential to unleashing the activity of God on earth. The key. Number two, whatever Jesus is talking about is about the church, you and me, taking the initiative with the absolute assurance that heaven is on our side. Now, one more time, I want you to look at this passage, because this is tricky. Jesus said, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. And whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. I didn't think Jesus was going to say that. I actually thought he was going to say the opposite. Whatever is bound in heaven is bound on earth. And whatever's loosed in heaven is loosed on earth. In other words, it all starts from heaven. But that's not what he says. He reverses it. And that's what ought to really catch us off guard, because Jesus is trying to say here, whatever God is doing in the world is going to happen through his church. And therefore, as the church is moving forward, as the church is obedient to the call to go into all the world and preach the gospel, that heaven's power now gets unleashed on earth, and it begins to be against the forces of darkness and despair and death. And so the keys of the kingdom is not waiting for one more command from Jesus. It's obeying the one command we know he gave to us to charge forward with the redeeming, restoring, renewing vision for the world. And when we do, that's when heaven gets busy. You don't sit around and wait for the power. You launch out in obedience, and when you launch out in obedience, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit says, okay, now they need our help. They didn't need our help to stay in the comfort zone. They didn't need our help to go to work every day and go to school every day, come home, watch ESPN, eat a meal, and walk around the neighborhood. A lot of people can do that without the power of the Spirit, but you need the power of the Spirit to push back the gates of darkness. And when you launch out of your comfort zone to do something that you could not achieve without the power of God, that's when heaven unleashes the power. Don't be waiting for the power to stay in your comfort zone. Lots of people can do that. But when you unleash something on earth, heaven unleashes power. When you bind up on earth, heaven begins to bind up. When you loose on earth, heaven begins to loose things up. That's what Jesus is saying. And when we do that, the gates of hell will not prevail against us. That, my brother and sister, was the vision of those early Nazarenes. We are on offense. Those early Nazarenes, listen, the people who started Wichita First Church of the Nazarene, they weren't down in some foxhole somewhere holding hands, singing Kumbaya and waiting for Jesus to come back. They had a plan to reach the world among Nazareth people. And that's what we are. Now, I'm going to wrap this up because I want to give some time for you to respond. But let me just say this. There are some people today in the world, even good people, who are trying to distract us from our roots. And this is what they say. They say, this is no time to take a risk. These are perilous times. These are times where the church needs to just hole up somewhere and just hold our ground. We need to be retreating, not charging, because we're liable to lose the whole thing if we charge out into this dangerous place. Brothers and sisters, I want to remind you, that's not what Nazarenes do. Nazarenes start homes for unwed mothers. Nazarenes take care of orphans. Nazarenes provide food for the poor. Nazarenes look out for single moms. Nazarenes come alongside people in recovery. Nazarenes take the gospel to the whole world, the holiness gospel. That's what we do. We are in the mission of setting Nazareth people free. Now, Wichita First, here's my request of you. As you think about your generosity, your praying, and your sending, don't have a maintenance mindset. If your mindset is maintaining what you have and protecting your history, then what you're doing is perpetuating an institution. But you're not called to perpetuate an institution. You're called to follow Jesus into his mission field. What's the mission field? Let me tell you a story about Bobby. Bobby was 10 years old when his father was killed, and it left he and his 5 little brothers and sisters orphans. When the foster care system found Bobby and his little brothers and sisters, they were living in a farmer's haystack, surviving on what fell off of the wagons. Bobby was homeless, he was orphaned, and he was starving to death. That was the 10-year-old Bobby that foster care put into homes. And then from the age of 10 to 18, Bobby was in 9 different foster care homes. The other thing about Bobby is that Bobby had polio when he was a little infant, and so he also had physical disabilities. He would walk with a limp, he was stooped over, he had a little bit of a speech impediment when he talked. So Bobby he had just fallen through the cracks. He didn't have parents. He never stayed in the same school for more than a year. He was failing all of his classes. He didn't have friends. Bobby was a Nazareth kid until when he was 17 years old. There was a Nazarene family in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, who went to the foster care system and said, "Give us your toughest kid. We don't want the cute little baby that everybody else wants. We want the kid that nobody else wants. Give us your Nazareth kid." And they said, "We got just the one for you." And Bobby went into this Nazarene home who had a mission to take the hardest kid. And for the first time in his life, Bobby heard the good news of Jesus. And he found out that there was somebody who loved him. And he said, "If this is true, this is the best news I've ever heard." And Bobby gave his heart to Christ at 17 years old. When he got out of the foster care system at 18, he came back to that little Nazarene home and little Nazarene church in Scottsbluff, Nebraska. And they discipled him, and he began to grow in his faith, and he met a young woman there, and they fell in love, and they got married. Bobby wanted to be a preacher, but nobody would accept him. He went to every Nazarene school and applied. Everybody said, "You don't have the education, you have the physical disabilities, so you can't be a pastor." But Bobby said, "I'm going to find a way to serve Jesus and to serve this church that I love." And he heard about a job opening at Bethany Nazarene College. And so Bobby, without a high school education, went to Bethany Nazarene College, and he worked in the maintenance department. He worked there for 20 plus years. But that was just his day job. You want to know what Bobby's real mission was? It was about telling people about Jesus. It was about helping them to find freedom in Christ. And when Bobby died at 50 years old, that's how old he was. He died at 50 years old. That Nazarene church that could seat 400 people was so full that people were sitting out in the foyer, and there were people all the way out into the parking lot. And one by one, those people came and they talked to Bobby's family, and they said, "Let me tell you how Bobby changed my life and how Jesus used him to help set me free." There were PhDs who taught in the school who went to Bobby who didn't have a high school education for spiritual advice. And the reason that story is so important to me, because Bobby was my dad. And now you know why I love the Church of the Nazarene so much. Because the Nazareth mentality of those early Nazarenes changed the trajectory of my entire family's life. I am here today as the product of people who had Nazarene missions on their mind. And I want to tell you something. When did we ever think Jesus asked us to play it safe? Who taught us that? We're not supposed to play it safe. We're supposed to take risks. We're supposed to be kingdom-minded people. There's going to be plenty of time. It's called eternity. That's where there's going to be a lot of rest and there's going to be a lot of comfort. Right now, we are on mission. You are on mission, and you get to be a part of that through global missions in the Church of the Nazarene. You can do things with your generosity and your praying and your sending and your going that most people can never think about doing. Listen, we need more Nazarenes who are saying, you know, I'd rather have a few mistakes now than have eternal regrets. And my prayer for you is that in these next few weeks, as you really consider not just what you're going to give, that's huge, that's important, but as you consider what's God wanting to do with my life, to take the keys of the kingdom of heaven and to push back the gates of hell. Because here's the promise. When you obey that call, the gates of hell will not prevail against you. Hell is terrified of a church on offense. Pastor.